Welcome to another edition of Simons Says, a podcast devoted to conversationalists and the curious-minded. Here's your host, me, the follically challenged Dave Simons, certified financial planner and all-around nice guy. Well, hi everybody, once again. Do you remember the first time that you ever exercised your American right and went into a polling place? I will never forget it because of the times that were going on around me in 1980. Yeah, that election. Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, and a lot of historians will tell you that's one of the most important elections in our history, particularly since the Great Depression, because it really set the country on a different path. It's one of the most influential elections as we went in a more conservative bent. Now, I'm an 18-year-old know-it-all as a freshman at Mizzou, but I was so into the environment at the time because everybody was talking about this election. And you have to know, I didn't have any political leanings. I didn't find out many years later how active my dad was in politics. It just was not discussed in the Simons household. And I should have known, because when we moved to this new place in the early mid-70s called Lake St. Louis, I helped my dad canvass the neighborhood as he ran for political office. He was one of the first two aldermen of Lake St. Louis, true story. But you didn't really run on a party affiliation back then out in Lake St. Louis. So when I'm at Mizzou, I'm not a Democrat, Republican. I don't really honestly know the difference at the time. So I was doing all my research. What you could do back then was you'd pick up a Time magazine or you would just get your information from your circle of friends. And at Mizzou, that was all my dorm mates, that was other students, and I enjoyed the heck out of that, just talking about it and learning. So who did I vote for? Was it Ronald Reagan, the challenger who obviously won? Nope. So it must have been Jimmy Carter. No. A lot of people forget there was an independent who ran in 1980. John Anderson. That may be coming back to some of you of my age. John Anderson was a 20-year congressman from the state of Illinois who was a Republican. But he had kind of soured on his party a little bit. He was one of the few Republicans early on who came out against the Vietnam War. Watergate really turned him off, as it did a lot of people, of course. So when the election came around in 1980, he at first ran as a Republican, but could clearly see the polling was heavily favoring Ronald Reagan. So he jumped out. Little history lesson for you as we start today's podcast. And then me being the 18-year-old know-it-all who wanted to stick it to the man, bring down the political establishment, because that's what young people think they can do, right? So I'm going to vote for the independent and I'm going to send a message. So I voted for John Anderson, who did get nearly 7% of the vote, by the way. So it was measurable. Now, why do I tell you that story besides basically revealing that I didn't know what I thought I knew back then? That is the thing that I remember most about that election cycle in 1980 as I was starting to come into my own politically a little bit and figure things out, was how I remember having discussions with people my age at the time, 18 to 22-year-olds, who were voting for the first time, people who grew up in a Republican household. And they had some great ideas and great thoughts. And I thought, wow, I can really attach myself to these conservative principles. But then I would hear from my liberal friends and those who grew up as Democrats. And I thought, that kind of sounds like my own parents in a way. I guess they're Democrats. And I took all of that in. But here's the thing that I remember most. Having these discussions with people in the same room, I don't ever recall anyone ever getting really upset. I don't ever recall anyone arguing or yelling. Nobody got up out of the room and walked out. We would even have political discussions because the 1980 election was so important. We would discuss these things in my college classes with our professors. And the professors were not directing us one way or the other. We had very good, just good debate with our professors and with college students, and then I could make up my own mind. And I know as we fast forward to today, that art, unfortunately, has been lost. Now people do get up out of the room. Families have been fractured because of it. People have lost friends over political debate. So it's very refreshing when we see people who are diametrically opposed politically, but who can still be friends, and in some cases, best friends. So that gets us to half of the Hancock and Kelley duo for today's edition of the podcast. And I would say this, if you've already watched the episode with John Hancock, welcome. Today we're going on the other side. And if you haven't, if this is your first foray into the two that I've recorded here in recent weeks, and you're watching Michael Kelley today, I urge you after this, please go and watch the one that we've already recorded with John Hancock. They've been gracious enough to allow me to separate them because they've been joined at the hip for a long time. They do have their separate businesses, but at least here in the St. Louis area and beyond, they are simply known as Hancock and Kelley on KMOX Radio, on Fox 2 News. They're interviewed in the paper, in journals, and they are very well known, but you don't have to be in St. Louis, I don't think, to appreciate their insights because they've been at this for a long time. So with that, we welcome today's guest on the left side of things, Michael Kelley. Michael, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So you kind of heard how I didn't have any real affiliation one way or the other, but I get the impression, listening to you for years, that it was almost preordained. You came out of the womb, basically, a Democrat because of your family and your dad. Is that a fair statement?
Somewhat, yeah. Obviously, my father was the head of the St. Louis AFL-CIO for 40 plus years.
Wow.
So I grew up really understanding workers' rights and the need for workers to have a seat at the table, to be able to bargain for their wages, hours, and working conditions. And so being exposed to that's always tended to be, especially in the 80s and 90s, tended to be a more left of center group. And yes, we were Democrats. My dad used to have a joke. I have 5 sisters. That when the boys would come to the house, to meet, there were 2 things that you better say. Number 1, you better say you're registered to vote. And if he asked you who you voted for, do not say Ronald Reagan or you're going to be leaving right then.
Do you remember having discussions when you were a young boy growing up in the house? Was it a politically filled house?
Well, we definitely understood the issues of workers and unions. And that was instilled into us from a very young age. I was one of 6 kids. I had 5 sisters. I was the only boy. I was number 5 of 6. So I had a unique opportunity to go everywhere with my father. So there's pictures of me from, the 80s and the 90s, even when I was a youngster, going everywhere with my father. So I was always exposed to what he was up to. And as a result, that really kind of indoctrinated me into adopting those same principles, which I still try to live on a daily basis.
Now, I guess that stayed with you because as you got older, you decided you wanted to go into politics, right? You actually studied that at UMSL here in St. Louis.
Yeah, when people talked about what is it that you want to do, I can remember when I was a youngster watching, and this was back when there was 4 television stations. Mm-hmm. So when the president was on, there was nothing on. And I was the weirdo who was watching the State of the Union address. I was crushed when Ronald Reagan was no longer our president. Like, what do you mean? It's not like the Pope. You don't stay there forever. And so I was brought up into the pageantry of what it meant to be a public servant. And then being exposed to so many people, whether it be Dick Gephardt or, Vince Shamel, a lot of local St. Louis political types, it really grew where I was. And from high school on, I knew I would always kind of be peripherally involved in both labor and potentially politics.
So that's what you went into in college, thinking that you would do what? Actually maybe run for office someday or follow in your dad's footsteps, or did you even know?
I think when I was really young, it was I wanted to be my dad and advocate for workers. As time went on, it was politics. I was never a person who wanted to put my name on the ballot. My dad always told me it's better to kind of have the ear of several rather than to be one. That's when I realized that really advocating for campaigns was where I wanted to be. And, you mentioned you were inspired by the 1980 race. Even though I didn't get to vote in 1992 because my birthday wasn't until June. I was really involved in the Clinton, George W. or H.W. Bush's campaigns.
And Ross Perot.
Yeah, and Ross Perot,
well.
Another third party. Yep.
So you get out of college and you do what?
I immediately started a consulting company that mainly tried to do voter registration and helped little local candidates that were running for school boards, etc. I got a call one day from my father who said, "Hey, I'm sitting here with Mr. Gephardt, Congressman Gephardt from St. Louis, and I think you ought to go down and visit with the folks at his office." And so I went down to Mr. Gephardt's office, and I got a job working as a Jefferson County Outreach Director in Jefferson County, Missouri, just south of St. Louis. And got my start there and met probably my greatest political mentor, a lady named Joyce Abusi, who is really a strong political advocate in the St. Louis area. And the rest is history from there. I got involved there. I later progressed to go on to be the COPE director, the Campaign on Political Elections for the AFL-CIO. Later, I was asked by Bob Holden to be the director of the Democratic Party. Mr. Gephardt ran for president again in 2004. So from about 2002 on, I traveled everywhere throughout the country with Mr. Gephardt as his aide, kind of everything from the guy who held the Kleenex to got the information from fax machines, et cetera, to remembering names of people, to making sure we got in and out of meetings. And after that was unsuccessful in 2004, I was crushed and came back to St. Louis and started a consulting company trying to run campaigns. Spent a lot of time playing golf. Nobody really wanted to hire me.
Yeah, probably.
And slowly but surely wound up building it from there. And now I'm privileged to be in a place where I advocate for Democratic and labor-friendly candidates that are running for office here in St. Louis, in Missouri, and for that matter, across the country. We do a lot of work.
So I want to stick on the Dick Gephardt thing because obviously in this part of the country, he's so well known, but even nationally, because as you mentioned, he did run for president. What was it? The line is so thin sometimes of I'm running for president and now all of a sudden I'm getting a lot of attention. I'm polling well. I've done well in the primaries to those that for whatever reason didn't connect. What do you think it was about Congressman Gephardt that kept him from getting to the very top?
Well, he was doggone close. He was within 4 votes of being Speaker of the House when I was working for him, and that really had been his goal. He was a person who started at the Board of Aldermen in South St. Louis, worked his way up, became a congressman. He actually ran against one of my father's best friends, a gentleman named Don Gralick, who was the head of the electricians union in St. Louis. He beat Don Gralick in the primary and came to my father's house when I was a youngster, I don't remember this, and said, "Bob, I will be the greatest friend organized labor has ever had, and you will see this play out over my career." And let me tell you, there was no better advocate for the AFL-CIO and for unions in Washington, D.C. than Dick Gephardt. And so throughout the 90s as NAFTA and GATT, remember those were issues that even though Bill Clinton became the face of them, they were being pushed by the right side of the country. Dick Gephardt was very treacherous about saying, look, we'll lose jobs as a result of this. So that informed why I was with him. Where he probably didn't connect in the 2004 race was probably out of his control. And that was the war in Iraq. President Bush and Colin Powell and others had come to Congressman Gephardt, the Democratic leader, and said to him, hey, we have this information, and we've got to do something here to stop Saddam Hussein. And as a result, after 9/11, Congressman Gephardt did a very famous ceremony called the Rose Garden ceremony, where he stood with President Bush and said, we're going to stand together, George W. Bush at the time, we're going to stand together and deal with this. And as a result, there was an insurgent by the name of Howard Dean, who any of these insurgent campaigns usually are the ones who find technology. And this was at a time when email was just starting up, and he was connecting online with folks, and it really became an anti-war message. Howard Dean later flounders with, well, we all know,
Famous screen,
and Iowa, etc. But it was really Howard Dean who probably did Dick Gephardt in by taking Iowa, which had been his stronghold in 1988 when he had run for president, and to put all of his negative attacks on him. And so it was like a murder-suicide, if you will, between Congressman Gephardt and Governor Dean.
Yeah. Did Dick Gephardt ever come out publicly? And if not, did he ever tell you privately, man, I wish I could have that over again with how supportive I was of that war. We were giving information that was not accurate, and I wish I could have a do-over. Did you ever have that discussion with him?
No, and you have to remember, in the time that he and I spent a lot of time together, we didn't know what we know now. Yeah. I don't know how he were to feel about it today, but Dick Gephardt's one of the most principled people I ever met. He's a man who lived by what I call the golden rule, to treat others as the way you want to be treated. I spent 3 years of my life every day, 24/7 with this man. I mean, we traveled in every state in this country and out of this country as he was running for president. He was the kindest man I've ever been around. I never once saw him raise his voice. I never once saw him lose his temper. He always stood for what he believed in, even when it wasn't popular. And I think he stood by it. He was informed on what he knew at that time, and he stood by it. How he feels about it today, I don't know.
Yeah. So it had to have been difficult for you. Well, you were a little younger, but during the Reagan years, I know how your dad felt, but there was definitely a conservative movement. Ronald Reagan, to this day, is revered by Republicans. He's their standard bearer in a lot of ways.
Is he?
Yeah, I think so, by a lot of Republicans. But you question that. So I kind of want you to jump in and say, what was that like for a Democrat, for a liberal to have gone through that decade before Bill Clinton and say, did you look at it and say, don't people understand what's really going on? Or I don't want to put words in your mouth. What did you think about that?
I was too young. I was bought into the pageantry of Ronald Reagan. I liked him. Mm-hmm. What I didn't like about him was what I was hearing at the dinner table or around my family. Yep. And he busted the airline, what do they call them? The
Air Traffic Controllers.
Air Traffic Controllers Union, which was a big no-no inside of our house and most labor houses, and that's kind of where the relationship spiraled from there. But I was bought into the pageantry and the majesty in the 80s of what government was and the reverence and decorum that we had, even when we disagreed. And it kind of just was caught up. Nothing was better than when the Sergeant at Arms would say, Mr. Speaker, President of the United States. I was so into that. I was the weirdo who was watching the State of the Union when all my other friends were mad because nothing else was on television.
Yeah, in the other episode with John Hancock, I talk about you talk about weirdo as a kid. I was the same way on that, Michael, because when President Nixon got on television and announced he was quitting the next day, I was 12 years, I had just turned 12. And where you didn't understand that presidents left after 2 terms, it's like, wait a minute, you did. When I saw the president say he was quitting, I'm like, you can do that? Right. You can just say, I quit? Right. I didn't understand the whole Watergate thing as much at the time. So I was also caught up in the pageantry of it.
If I can jump in, I think I was 3rd or 4th grade when the Challenger blew up.
Okay.
So we had been watching that at school that day. And if you remember, the president came on that evening and spoke to the country. And at that time, it wasn't that popular in our house, but I remember my parents both crying as they were watching that speech. And that really drew me in on what a special human being in the way this man connected with people. Yeah. And even though I understood that he didn't necessarily stand for our principles, it was a guy I had great respect for and kind of wanted to be like.
That's a very interesting take, and we will circle back to that in that we could still respect the office, which I'm not so sure happens with as much frequency today. But I really want to ask you a little bit more about the workers' rights thing, because I get it. I just get this sense of passion for you because this is family origin, but it has continued to be such an important topic for you today. When you look at today, and it's 2023, what do you think are the most important issues facing, I don't know, for lack of a better term, the common worker, the common man and woman out there that they're really up against?
Well, we're living in the me world where it's all about me. The celebrities are no longer the politicians or the movie stars. They're the people who make the most money, and sometimes people who cut other people's throats to make the most money. And so I don't know that the ideals of what labor stands for, wages, making sure that people have a decent living and that can afford a life, a middle-class lifestyle, hours, that they're not working ridiculous amounts of time. Now, I have a father who was representing workers and worked all the time, but we also had unique opportunities. And then working conditions. Fortunately, deaths on job sites have been going down, but as things have changed, there's other things that are coming in that are affecting workers' places of work, whether it be technology or robots, and still a lot of safety concerns because people still drive 70 miles an hour while somebody's out there paving the road. And so I always grew up understanding that. My father forced us to get a job the day that we were old enough to be able to get one. No matter when we were in college or afterwards, we were to be home in the summertime working. I worked in the grocers union. I worked in the stagehands union. I still carry my grocers union card to this day because they were advocating for me when I was just a high school and college kid trying to make a couple of bucks to put it into my gas tank.
Do you feel like when you look across the other side at your Republican friends that they don't share those same values or they're trying to undercut the workers? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that we've gotten into a world of sound bites where people use the word like union bosses. Well, I was the son of a union boss. There was hardly anything bossy about this guy. I mean, other than he was fighting for workers. Workers and folks who advocate for workers almost got demonized. It became a bad word if you were union bosses in the unions. Fortunately, I think that's shifting again. Now, we're seeing unions with popularities in the 70s and 80%, which we haven't seen. But the labor movement's been dying since almost it was invented. And so, it's something that's connected with my soul. I see the Republicans in the past have demonized unions, but now I see them kind of embracing them. They kind of equate them to more of a political organization, which is a small sliver of what unions do. The majority of what unions do is really the bargaining and the health and welfare issues that face workers on a daily basis. And most employers who have unions are grateful they have them because they have trained workers, they have safe workers, they know that their workers are getting a fair wage, and they also have the stability of knowing that the money that they're helping contribute into savings is not being squandered in a 401k or whatever. It's in a defined benefit or in some parameters that really preserve that so that people can retire and live a good life.
So the first time that I joined a union, and I didn't know much about them or the rules, my first television job, because I broadcast journalism major from Mizzou which may surprise people who don't know that since I've been in the world of finance for 30 years, but I actually had another life when I had good hair back in the day. And I was a television reporter and sometimes anchor. Well, I always wanted to get back home to St. Louis, so Channel 4, KMOV. They had just changed from KMOX TV to KMOV and Union Shop. And so as a reporter, we were set up kind of like this studio, interviewing somebody I don't know. And I was always used to, you help the photographer take down the lights and all that. So I went to reach for one, and this guy yells at me because he's part of the IBEW and you don't touch his stuff. And I'm like, what? He goes, if you start taking down these lights and these cameras, I lose my job. So it's a rule. Talent, and talent is a word that's used for the people on it's a ridiculous term, but that's what they're called. Talent doesn't touch the equipment. Like, okay, buddy, okay. But there's a reason why I tell that story, because that's why I think a lot of people look at unions and say, man, we do need you. And the changes and the help that workers have had over the last 100+ years have been terrific. But sometimes you can take it too far and it becomes silly. And all this young reporter wanted to do was help the guy and just take a light down.
Yeah, my imagination is that probably came from a safety issue from back in the day where lights were bigger. And, by having someone move them, if you were to have gotten hurt as a talent, that would have been the responsibility of that person. I think that's less and less what is necessarily the focus, particularly when most of the bargaining power in today's world seems to be on the side of the management or the owner. So yeah, I understand there's some of that legacy stuff that people may not like, but whatever, all of those rules that come are derivatives of something that happened. My dad used to say, people who don't like unions, if you treat people right, they're not going to be a part of a union. Anytime when people are being treated poorly, they're going to band together and advocate for themselves. I mean, whether it be, you can go through so many examples of that, not only in work, but in life. And that's really the driver. So some of those antiquated rules, I get it. There's also the things about, every time I drive on the highway, I see a guy just standing there. Well, there's 3 other guys working, and somebody's got to keep an eye out. So yeah, I'd tell people to hasten your judgment. And the best thing about learning about what it's like to be a worker and why they're protecting those roles is to actually go out and do them.
Yes, right.
And let me just tell you, I wouldn't trade my life to go back to being a stagehand or a grocer right now. That is tough, hard work. Those people deserve the wages they get, and their dignity should be preserved.
And by the way, I tell that story as an illustration because I ended up learning to love my photographers and still are friends with them a couple of days. And my dad, a retired college professor, very strong union of education here in the state of Missouri. So that's one thing that I did get from him. All right, I'm going to shift gears and I'm going to give you a date specifically. June 6th, 2015. Here comes Donald and Melania down the escalator. What did you think?
Laughable. I thought it was funny. I thought even more so following that, the first debate, I was like, really? This is where the Republicans are at? I was with John Hancock. We were in Webster Groves doing a thing for KMOX at, I forget the name of the bar that's there. It's a friend of John's called Politics and Trivia. And we were watching the debate, and then we would answer questions about it. And I thought, well, this is just a sideshow. He's a circus. He's a carnival barker. Surely everybody's going to see through this, and what a joke this was. So it was laughable, and I thought it was a joke.
I think a lot of people did, and even Republicans will tell you, and John does in the episode if you haven't seen it, out of like 17 original candidates, Donald Trump was his 17th favorite pick.
Yeah.
But being the good Republican leader in the state, he did support him. And as you'll see it if you haven't watched it, he did vote for him. Although what he thinks about Mr. Trump now is a little different, as it is for a lot of Republicans. But you had, as this was unfolding, and it really didn't matter what he said, the whole thing on the Access interview about what he could do with women, a lot of people thought, well, that's it. Mm-hmm. But his poll numbers went higher. When he said something about John McCain, he likes people who don't get captured, and his poll numbers didn't change. Were you worried at that point? Like, what is this country creating here before us? Or did you still think, this will still pass? There's no way he'll be elected.
It did not hit me till election night.
Really?
I was sitting at KMOX. I thought there's no way in heck this guy's going to get elected. At about 8:30 in the evening on election night, Mark Reardon, who's a conservative radio host, and John and I were there. I went silent. I couldn't believe that Donald Trump, a man who I just think is, I don't think he's capable. I think he's got a lot of issues that are all driven by me, and this me society, that there was no way that the people would vote him in. And when it happened that night, and for a couple of weeks afterwards, I was shocked. I couldn't believe that this actually happened. And then if you remember, setting up the government, those first transition days, we wanted those days from a Democratic perspective to last forever. Barack Obama was a statesman who really was emblematic of everything Donald Trump said he was going to be. I'm going to be the best guy. I'm going to pick good people. I'm not going to do anything illegal. He didn't. And then here comes Donald Trump, and we've seen what's happened since then. But in the weeks afterwards, I still was in shock. To this day, while I understand some of the anger and energy that Donald Trump may touch into, I don't know how anyone in today's society can look at this with the confrontations that we have now in Ukraine and China, can think that this man would be the best person to be in charge of the whole world.
But you know, the very people that you've talked about and that you really are behind, the worker, men and women, blue collar especially, that's where a lot of his support is. How do you rectify that?
Well, I think that Donald Trump has tapped into one of the most powerful drugs there is, which is anger. And he's used it quite effectively. The communicators of those on the right are brilliant with the words that they use. And they have fashioned arguments on very narrow issues to make very broad statements. So I understand why people can say, Donald Trump fights for me. He's the little guy. Everybody keeps telling me that, I'm so blessed and I'm so privileged. But, my life's hard, too. I get in the car in the suburbs at 5 a.m. and I'm thinking about how I'm going to reach my child's tuition or be able to afford the new braces that my daughter needs. And I think that those narrow issues kind of tap into that anger that people have. I'm hopeful as we go through this a second time that people are going to take a broader lens and remember the absolute chaos of the Trump presidency with a lot of the things he said. Even those who were supportive of him were like, look, while I agree with some of his anger, I just want things to be normal. I don't want the president involved in my college football or where I'm going to eat food. And that's where I'm hopeful that we're going to have clearer eyes, but it's a scary time.
Well, he surprised you once before, as he did a lot of people. This indictment situation, as we're recording it, yes, he has been indicted. That's as far as we know as we're recording this in early April. He's always going to have his base. How big that base is, I don't know. There are different polling, but he's got a section of the GOP that is going to be behind him no matter what. The question is, independents and people who consider themselves moderate Republicans, what are they going to do about this whole issue of Donald Trump being indicted? And there are those who believe it's actually helping him in some degree. Is that a possibility?
Totally. Right now in the primary, it's helping him. In the general, I don't see a pathway for Donald Trump to win the White House. It's getting so much harder with the Electoral College for Republicans to win the requisite amount of elector votes that they need. So I still am not sure I see a pathway for him to win in this next election, but I understand why it fires up a base, particularly those of people who may not be pleased in their current situation in life who want to stick it to the man. The man happens to be Joe Biden right now. Yeah. I signed on with Joe Biden very early. There were a lot of people who there were far more progressive ideas inside the Democratic Party. I just didn't see it. He seemed to me to be a person that was able to connect and almost bring calm and stability. And I think even now, at a time where we can admit that he's very aged and older, and obviously some of his skills and faculties are diminishing, I have to tell you, I will be as strong for Joe Biden this time as I was last time if he chooses to run, because I don't want to go through 4 more years of what we dealt with Donald Trump.
So it almost sounds like, yes, you, of course, would support Joe Biden in 2024 if Donald Trump is running. Well, I would say probably against any Republican. You can tell me if I'm wrong, but is that more of an anti-Trump or anti-GOP vote as opposed to, I love Joe Biden as a president, he's doing a great job, or I'll add something onto it, because Democrats will look at Republicans and go, wow, you guys have a Trump problem that you've got to figure out because it's splintering your party. Republicans will say, well, maybe, but you guys have a Joe Biden problem. And it's not even necessarily policy. Also, many people will say it is, but I'm talking about what you had just mentioned, the ageism part of this. Any reasonable person can look at him at times and say, man, I'm not sure he knows where he is at this split second. it's not an unfair observation. I think
Sure.
it's reasonable. So how do you look at that?
Because he's got the right people around him, and he's also had policies that have finally delivered for folks on left of center. My entire life, we've heard through the Reagan years, et cetera, that the way that we're going to make the economy work for everybody is we're going to cut taxes for the people at the very top, and the folks on the bottom are going to, be living this greater life. It's harder and harder for people to make it inside the middle class. Joe Biden was the first president to actually deliver tax cuts, meaningful tax cuts, to those of us on the bottom side. And when we saw the auto industry, the airline industry, the banking industry, the insurance industry, all bailed out by government, finally, we saw somebody who was caring for us, who was like, yeah, I know what it's like to be like you are. And you know what? You do deserve this $2,500, et cetera. So even though it may not have been great policy, because surely the tax cuts for the richest weren't the great policies, we've seen CEO pay go up to 1,000, 10,000 times what the average worker was, even since the 80s. We're seeing a president who's actually articulating the values of the working man and standing up for working people, standing up for unions in conversation, not in secret saying, oh, I'm with the union guys, blah, 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 saying, no, if you're going to do this kind of work, you're going to be the best skilled and the best trained, and that's union. And so to finally have somebody who wasn't afraid to be supportive of us in the sunlight and not just be there with us in the shadows was awesome.
So speaking of the shadows, who is kind of in the shadow now as a potential candidate? Let's say Joe Biden, people get with him behind the scenes and go, Joe, thanks for your contributions to American politics over the years. They convince him, you came into an important spot in American history for these 4 years. We would like you to step aside, and you open it up. Who is out there, you think, who is a potentially viable Democrat candidate?
Well, Dave, as we sit here and tape this in April, I'd been saying for the past year I didn't think Joe Biden would run for re-elect. I'm now kind of resolved that is the case. And I think that's primarily being driven by the fact that he's running against Donald Trump. And now's not a time for a bunch of disorganization on the Democratic side when the Republicans are, from my perspective, in free fall. And my dad always told me that names emerge as time goes on.
Yeah, that's right.
Nobody knew who John Edwards was when he was running, or even a Howard Dean, So, but right now, if at a last minute, Joe Biden was unable to do it for health or some other reasons, I think you're probably looking at a Governor Newsom or J.B. Pritzker across the river. You could potentially see a Sherrod Brown type, a working Democratic congressman type, but it's going to have to be somebody who's going to be able to have money and draw star power, and hard to beat the governor of Illinois and California when it comes to being able to garner attention.
I noticed you did not mention the current vice president.
No, I don't think Kamala Harris is, and I think that's one of the problems that the president faces right now, is whether or not he continues to retain her. I thought Kamala Harris had some great promise. I think she's the victim of poor staff work. She's not the first vice president to be in that case. Dan Quayle found himself to be in the same realm. Dick Cheney, he was kind of Darth Vader, so who knows? He kind of was the guy pulling the strings. So I don't see a pathway for Kamala Harris, and it will be interesting to see if the president retains her as he goes to the next election.
Yeah. One of the things that the Democrats will have to also keep in mind as they look for potential candidates, whether it's 24 or beyond, is this word progressive, and how progressive can a candidate be? And I look at various large cities right now, San Francisco, for example, even here in St. Louis, New York, other places like that. You've had some very progressive district attorneys being recalled. Even progressives have said, well, we tried it, but it didn't work. Now, Chicago, that was an interesting election. I'm not steeped in the politics there like you might be, but from everything that I can understand, they basically traded one progressive for a completely, maybe even more progressive mayor. You, as someone who is on that side politically, does that concern you that that side of progressive politics in inner cities does not connect with the average American and even the average Democrat?
Yes, but I don't think it's unique to the Democratic Party, what we're witnessing. The same thing's happening on the Republican side. I mean, candidate after candidate is trying to be out-Trump. On the Democratic side, we've seen progressives that have emerged. Look, I guess I consider myself a progressive. I don't know. We've bastardized these words, so I don't even know what they really stand for anymore. I consider myself a traditional Democrat in the sense that I believe in, safety. I believe that government should play a role in helping those who can't help themselves, which is the core belief of why I'm a Democrat. But I also believe that police officers are working people just like a guy swinging a hammer. And by the way, you're in a far more dangerous job at times than a lot of folks might find themselves in. So yes, I understand that the word progressive turns a lot of folks off. It turns me off. Some of the policies, particularly as it relates to policing and crime and incentives. There's this idea that if we're incentivizing a company to relocate to a particular area like St. Louis, we ought not be paying, tax dollars to be, help a deal with some of those costs. Well, I'm here to tell you that you can have that thought process, but they don't have that thought process in Nashville or San Antonio or pick a city. And so to unilaterally disarm, I think, is one of the problems progressives have put us in combination with a lot of this policing. And look, there has been a lot of injustice inside the criminal justice system, particularly as it relates to marijuana. I mean, here we are, we have a bunch of Republicans arguing we shouldn't be putting Donald Trump in jail over this, that, or the other. We all know he broke the law, but we shouldn't hold him to that. But that guy who sold some weed 10 years ago still finds himself in jail. That's something that needs to be changed. And that's where I think progressive thought works. I think the real disconnect where the Republicans are exploiting the cleavage that exists inside the Democratic Party is over this urban-suburban divide. And a lot of the rhetoric that comes from my side of the party is dealing with a lot of folks inside the inner core and those who find themselves most significantly disadvantaged, who need the help of government. People out in St. Charles or in suburban find themselves needing that same things, but they almost feel like, wait a minute, you're telling me that the reason that this person's life in the city is wrong is because of something I got because I didn't do it? And I think they find themselves in a place like, wait, things continue to go up for me. Health and care and health insurance is going through the roof. My kid needs new braces. And so that's something that the Democrats are going to have to reconcile, is this pitting urban versus suburban voters against each other. I think rural America is really identified with the Republicans, mainly because Republicans are not for change. They want to go back to the days of that it's always been. It's just the nature of being a conservative. You want to keep things the way they are. And Democrats, even in the suburbs, want to see some changes made so that it's fair and more just for everybody. But we don't want to be lectured that the reason that the whole world's going to hell in a handbasket is because you're out there working your tail off and you've got a significant advantage over somebody else.
I think that's refreshing. I think a lot of people on the right, hearing you say this, Michael Kelley, they find it refreshing because they're saying, amen. I don't want to be called a racist. I don't want to be called misogynist because I was born a certain way, because, man, I'm struggling too. You just articulated it, I think, very well. And I think that's part of the problem that we have in this country. Blame it on social media or whatever, but all we get are the extremes. Mm-hmm. That's all we hear. It's like a cudgel over us all the time. And I think after talking to John Hancock with an episode in you today, that I think more people are a little bit more moderate, a little bit more in the center, and that we can have these discussions.
Yeah. I'm fearful, though, that what's happening with the extremism on both sides is it's running people out of the process, where they're saying, you know what, they're all bums, and I don't want to have anything to do with it.
That is happening.
Because if you look at the gun debate, the Republicans they're not where the majority of Americans are in terms of doing away with assault weapons, whether on choice issue. They're not where the majority of Americans are. On the policing issue on the left, they're not where the majority of Americans are, where we're going to fix this crime problem with less cops. And so what I think a lot of people do is they sit there and say, you know what, it doesn't really matter what happens. And I'm sure John hinted to this, but what we're seeing now is elections being decided in primaries. And when elections are decided in primaries, the loudest, fattest, yelling voices are the ones that get the attention. And if you only have to get 30% of less than 50%, that's what's going to win it. And so we're seeing this run to the extremisms that are winning primaries, and then most of the generals don't even matter.
How can you fix that? Constitutionally, can you?
Yeah, potentially you could change the way we do elections in this country, but really it's going to probably come down to people being fed up and getting involved. And I do believe that choice and guns and policing, so I see it on both sides, could help bring people back in and say, this person's a kook, that person's a kook, this is where I'm at, and we're coming back. And I hope that happens. But we may be continuing to go through this problem where a lot of people aren't participating. And that's, when primaries are the main driver of elections, that's not good.
Yeah, we're not well served. You have touched on a subject I did want to talk to you about, because listening to you on Camo X and watching you and reading your stuff, you seem to be as passionate today about anything about guns.
Mm-hmm.
If you were king for a day and you could give us all Michael Kelley legislation on gun control, what would it look like?
No assault weapons, no automatic weapons. Probably more where we're at in the 1990s. A lot of what's being said on the right is true. There's mental illness, but mental illness exists in other countries. We're not having these mass shootings. But do you really need a gun that would annihilate a deer where you're not even going to be able to eat it? These are weapons of war that were made for one reason and one reason only, and that's to kill a lot of human beings in a short period of time. So I would probably go back to the restrictions of the 80s and 90s. Ultimately, what this is going to take is cultural change. And I do believe that this gun thing, it's a script, right? The Democrats say this is horrible, we need gun control. The Republicans say, what about all this other stuff that they truly don't care about, otherwise they do something, and then we go down the road. So what I do see happening is young people, when I say young people, the people who work for me and younger, they don't see the gun stuff. They don't see the immigration issue the way that a lot of the rest of us do. And I think that just like recycling has become a part of our lives now, we all throw the 10 cans into the recycling machine. That happened because young people changed us, and they became the people who were in charge. I think young people are going to change us on guns, and that's what's going to change us. But immediately, I'd do away with assault weapons, and why not register your weapon? Who cares? If you're truly a gun owner who's doing it for the right reasons, what do you have a problem registering it? You register everything else in your life. You've given your fingerprints to the government. Every time you tell you they're watching you on your phone, what do you care? And I just don't get guns. I've shot them. I like to shoot the clay pigeons. Mm-hmm. I've never shot an animal. I don't want to kill anything. I do most of my hunting at Schnucks and so our local grocery store. But it's just, I just don't get the obsession with guns. I kind of liken it to the same when I go to buddies in my house and they show me their gun cabinet, and I just think it's weird in the same way I thought my grandma's precious moments were weird. Who collects this stuff and just looks at it?
Well, the right would say, okay, understand that maybe some things need to be done, especially as we're recording
this. But they're
doing
nothing.
But we had another thing in Louisville as we're recording this. Anyway, but they would say, Michael, it's part of Americana, right? We've had guns from the beginning, all right? Yeah, we didn't have assault rifles or machine guns or anything like that. But even 50 years ago, we had that kind of weaponry, and people did not go into classrooms.
You didn't have access to AR, whatever they're called.
Okay, let's just say even a handgun.
Yeah, okay. But they can definitely do that.
But so you didn't, we didn't hear reports in the 1880s that we're aware of people going into one-room schoolhouses and shooting 6 kids. It just didn't happen. In the 1950s, it didn't happen even with stuff. This is a modern day culture issue in America. So we've had guns. What has changed though? Where now, is it a copycat thing? Is it I don't know if that's necessarily.
I think it's the access to guns.
But we've always had access.
But we haven't had the amount of guns that we have even in the 80s. I mean, there's now more guns in this country than there are people. That wasn't the case in the 1980s. We don't want teachers to pick out books for curriculums, but we want to arm them so that we can deal with this problem. I mean, it's mind-blowing. I mean, it's just where's the common sense gone in nearly everything? You can have a right of center perspective and a left of center's perspective as long as you got a little bit of common sense. I mean, I can see some gray area on some things that it makes sense. I don't want to take your gun away if that's what you want to go hunt and shoot, but do you need an AR-15? No, or whatever they're called? No, you don't.
Well, it's the slippery slope argument. Okay, you come for this, but next is my handgun.
But why is that only a conversation we can have when it comes to guns, but not when it comes to speech? When it comes to books that are being read in schools? Why are we spending all this time throughout our country right now banning books because we want you to remember the thought process this way, but we can't do it with guns? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to me. This is the irrational thing that's going on in our country, and we've lost common sense. Come on. We all know you don't need an AR-15 to do anything other than to kill humans in a war setting.
It is going to be interesting if we could come back 10 years from now and say, oh, this happened. Because I think you're right. There does seem to be a growing, even among gun owners, people I talk to, a frustration to say, okay, I guess maybe we need to, almost reluctantly saying maybe we need to do something here.
Dave, my entire life, I've grown up around the labor movement. These are folks who like to hunt and fish. They have more rights to hunt and fish now than they've ever had. So this idea of the slippery slope being taken away from them, they didn't have access to these guns 30 years ago. Most of these guys want to go out and shoot their deer or, do their target practice or whatever. Have at it. But you don't need an AR-15 or whatever they're called. And that's this bastardization of our arguments that we have right now, where everybody has to run to the extremes. Do you really think Joe Biden is going to come and take your gun? They can't pave the roads. They're going to put microchips in your vaccine. Folks, come on. This is the government. It's made up of us. We know what we're capable of. Knock it off. Let's bring back common sense.
There's a whole other podcast there. And someday
sure.
I'm going to do it on some of the conspiracies that are out there. But we digress for a second. Well, on the gun thing, you kind of touched on it. Countries the people have been taken over by totalitarian governments because they didn't have guns. So I have my guns when the government comes knocking on my door. But you're saying that's silly.
Come on, dude. The government's got F-18s and nuclear bombs, and you think you're going to stop them when the balloon, you're going to go out and shoot it? Give me a break. That's where we've lost our heads. Let's just get some common sense about us. You know what the most powerful weapon every person has is the right to vote. And if we actually got out there and do it on a regular basis, we wouldn't have to worry about some of this stuff because most of us do have common sense. You go to a ball game, you go to a grocery store, people are nice to each other. People are kind. We are good people inherently. Yes, evil exists and it needs to be dealt with, but we're making this to an extreme where we are losing common sense.
Is a lot of this driven by social media? I personally think it is because I do a lot of traveling. I know you can do a lot of that, especially come time of political season. Just the last year, I have been to 16 states and I do a lot of driving. I love driving because I get to talk to people all the time. And I have been everywhere from Eugene, Oregon, Madison, Wisconsin. You can't get much more left than that, to recently Fort Worth, Texas, down through Mississippi and Alabama. Can't get much more Trump country than that. I don't get a sense of a lot of angst. When I talk to people, it is people going to work every day. Yeah, if you pull them to the side, they might be very passionate in their feelings. You get on Twitter and Facebook, it is a cesspool. And you really do buy into the concept. Are we going to have a civil war? My answer is, I don't think so. But you wouldn't know that on social media. Should we have more regulation of this?
Potentially, but isn't that the slippery slope, Dave? The same people who want to regulate the internet now are the ones who are telling you can't regulate it with guns. No, we need to use common sense is what's going on. When I started in politics, there was no internet. We didn't have cell phones. I used to have to get on the phone and call the local reporter and spend 20 minutes yelling and advocating my point of view in the hopes that I would get one sentence in an article. Now, Politicians don't even have to deal with the media. They can put out their own thought processes and at the same time preying on either your best or worst instincts with that stuff and, you know, getting into that hatred that maybe exists in all of us on both sides of the aisle and leveraging that. And so then you couple that with algorithms that say, hey, Dave looked at something on Donald Trump, therefore we need to keep sending him this far right stuff. I see it in my own social media stuff. And I do think it's problematic. I think there needs to be some accountability. I don't think it's just a TikTok driven thing. I don't like the fact that Mark Zuckerberg or Dorsey or any of these guys have the information that we have. But, you know, English, German, Italian, those no longer matter. Ones and zeros are the language of our world.
Good point.
And it has taken over, and, you know, we're going to have to learn how to regulate it like we've regulated most other things.
You know, I had mentioned my dad was a college professor, and now I'll go ahead and admit it because he wouldn't care if I said this, but he was and is as progressive as you can get.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I mentioned before, I didn't know that growing up because, interestingly, it was never discussed in the household. Right. I learned about it after the fact. This is a man who's in his mid-80s and even recently marched in protest in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm like, I don't agree with my dad, but I love the fact that he's still part of the political process and he's making himself known.
Right.
He marched he taught at Flo Valley in the 60s and 70s here in St. Louis. It's a junior college. He marched with his students. Anti-Vietnam protests. He is disgusted what's happening in college campuses today by his own side, in that you can have a conservative speaker get shouted down to the point they have to leave, escorted by police. Some speakers who get invited never even get that far. They might even bail out before they get there. Do you see this as an issue, or do you think it's overblown?
I don't think it's unique to college campuses. I'm a Catholic. Strong believer in my faith. And for my entire adult life, they've been telling me that everybody that I support, who I believe is living in some principles, the golden rule of taking care of those who can't take care of themselves, shouldn't be voting for them because of X, Y, and Z reason. And so this is the polarity that exists not only on college campuses, it existed inside my Catholic church. It exists inside your local troop for the Boy Scouts. It's just, this is part of the human nature that exists. And I mean, I love when people complain about college campuses. There's no doubt about it that there's progressive thought processes happening inside of college campuses. But one of the things we want college kids to do is to go and learn and expand and grow their minds. So they're making a big deal of it. I don't think it should turn violent, and I don't think it should be problematic. But in the same way that I had to deal with it as growing up, still as a Catholic today, being told that I was voting for baby killers who were out trying to make sure that moms could feed their kids. Candidates were out trying to make sure that moms could feed their kids. So I think people just have to use common sense.
The overturn of Roe v. Wade. Some people, even on the right, are worried, even though they support it. I'm so glad that we have that kind of legislation. I'm glad we have a Supreme Court that did this. But I've seen some local elections starting to turn the other way because of that issue. Could you have foreseen that?
Sure. 80% of Americans believe that abortion should be legal in some form or another. It's an unpopular position that the pro-life community has taken for a number of reasons, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole of incest and rape, et cetera, and when a woman realizes she's pregnant, et cetera. I think this is one of those places where the push and pull of government right now, it's pulling us to the extremes, needs to bring some common sense into it. Nobody thinks that a dad who rapes a 14-year-old girl and she's pregnant, that she ought to hold that baby to term. The majority of people aren't there. And so I think we're going to hopefully see this change over time. And I don't know, I think the Republicans, when it comes to this whole choice issue or life issue, as they would call it, are kind of like the dog who caught the car. They don't know what to do. It was just an easy soundbite to win elections, just like we'd say, oh, the Democrats are going to come take your guns. It was easy sound bites. But now the reality is this is being enforced, and guess what? People don't like it.
Well, I told the story in some dramatic fashion. I didn't mean it to be dramatic, but I got more response on a Camo X segment that I
know the exact one you're talking about.
where I revealed with my mom's permission that I am here because of a rape. My mom was raped at 18. And so I'm adamant about on the pro-life side because I wouldn't be here otherwise. But I made this point that, interestingly, my mom is pro-choice. And she didn't, by the way, I didn't know this till I was 57 years old, 3 years ago. She had I don't know my biological father, but but she finally, when I was 57, decided that she was going to come clean and tell me what happened. And I was blown away that day. I cried the rest of the day. I couldn't believe it. You feel like it's a weird thing that I won't even go down that road. Maybe that's another segment sometime. But I was already pro-life. I became even more adamant about it because I thought I've lived such a wonderful life. Yes, heartache and heartbreak like everybody, but I'm so blessed and I'm glad that my mom chose what she did, even though this was pre-Roe v. Wade. And it would have been difficult for her to get an abortion in rural Kansas anyway. The point that I make there is that, interestingly, when I asked her about this, she's revealing this story for the first time, she said, but I'm pro-choice. And I said, well, okay. I know you're on the left side politically, but I thought maybe because of a choice you made 57 years ago. And she said, no, because I don't feel like I have the right to tell somebody else who has gone through my situation that they're being forced to have that child. And it did change the trajectory of my mom's life forever. She was in college, she was a freshman, had to drop out, never went back to school, ended up becoming a secretary. I'm thankful she made that decision. The reason I'm telling you that story is I hate when people make it so simple. And it's just black and white. Pro-life, that's the way it is, which I'm on that side. Pro-choice, that's the way it is. Well, a lot of times there are specific situations where it's more nuanced than that, and we need to listen to each other.
Well, growing up with 5 sisters and a mother, you know, and I know the stupid things and decisions I've made in my life. Who am I to be telling others what decisions they should be making in theirs? And so I appreciate your mom's position. I'm grateful you're here.
Thank you.
You know, and I think a lot of people want to make that decision in their life. I just don't know that they want the big arm of government telling them, you know, what they should be doing with their own biology. And that's kind of where I fall. I mean, fortunately, this isn't a consequence that I will ever face. Not a consequence, but whatever. I'm not going to be getting pregnant, so therefore I'm going to yield to those who let them make their own decisions.
All right. Let's turn our attention to something that's a lot more fun to talk about, and that is your relationship with a certain John Hancock. Now, I want to get your remembrance of this because he does in the episode that I did with him, the first encounter that he really had with you at a public event. Tell us about that.
Well, John Hancock, and remember, I was young. I was probably 24, 25 years old, just taking over as the head of the Democratic Party.
That is young for taking over that role.
Mrs. Carnahan was running for re-election. You'll remember she won the election when her dead husband, Mel Carnahan, our governor, won the election against John Ashcroft. She went on to serve. She was running for re-election. John Hancock was having a press conference at the Republican Party headquarters in Jefferson City. I think they called it the Ronald Reagan headquarters, which, you know, they named everything after him. And
you say with disdain.
Whatever. Yeah, I mean, whatever. So I remember they were going to say some bad things about Mrs. Carnahan. They'd put out a press release. So I showed up. And I kind of commandeered his press conference. This, remember, pre-cell phones. We may have had cell phones, but they were the flippers or the bags and stuff like that. No Blackberries, none of that kind of stuff. And so I crashed the press conference and kind of injected myself into the thing.
And how does that work? Are you like behind cameras?
But I wasn't going up there and yelling at him. Yeah. But when he was making his pitch to the reporters, I was in the back handing out my stuff.
Oh, that's awesome.
So he announced it. Well, I did the same thing. Jim Talon had been working at Washington University, and we were suggesting that Washington University was circumventing campaign finance laws by paying Jim Talon while he was a candidate. And I had a press conference there, and guess who showed up at my press conference was John Hancock. So our relationship started out in an adversarial way. But because, and I learned this from my father too. Remember, he was the head of the AFL-CIO. And in most negotiations come down to the head of the company and the head of the union. And so in a lot of places, he played that role. These were people he got along with, whether it be Mr. Bush at Anheuser-Busch or Andy Craig at what's now called Bank of America. It was Boatman Bank back in the day. And they would argue feverishly in the press with each other. You know, that August Bush is trying to take away the livelihoods of regular people, and that Bob Kelley, he's a no good union boss who's stealing union dollars, blah, blah, blah. But then they would have a conversation, and they would know because eventually they're in it together. They're going to work it out. And so John and I were into enough settings together where we realized the humanity inside of each other. John Hancock's not that different than me. He believes in most of the things I believe. I believe in most of the things he believes. We have a different philosophy on the way that you get there. And I will tell you, one of the best things I ever did in my life was when I met John Hancock, that we allowed this relationship to evolve. I still think he's the most politically flawed human being I know, but he truly is my best friend.
Yeah.
I understand his thought process. He's helped me evolve in the way that I view the world. I think I've helped him evolve in the way that he views the world. And at the end of the day, we're not surrendering our principles. We're actually showing common sense that, yes, there's two sides to everything. And somewhere in the middle, or sometimes right of center or left of center, is where the victor is going to become. So do you want a piece of the pie or do you want the whole pie? And that's a lot of what's going on in our politics right now is, gosh darn it, if we don't get it this way, we're not getting it anyway. Mm-hmm. Well, that's what we're getting.
That's why.
Rather than getting some type of a compromise. And I just love this man. He is one of the most decent human beings I have ever met in my entire life. If John Hancock ran for office tomorrow, I would work for him.
Is that right? Even on the GOP side?
Even on the GOP side. I would tell him I'm going to proactively speak against things that you and I disagree on. But at the end of the day, John Hancock wants people in the middle class to make more money. He doesn't want kids being shot in schools. You know, he knows that I want, companies to make money. If there's no companies, there's no unions. He knows where I'm at on, hey, if you want to go shoot a deer, that's your deal, not my game, but that's your deal. But do you need an AK-47? And so even we can understand the differences and find that common ground and that connection.
You think it's because the two of you are humble enough to hear each other? I ask it in that way because I wonder if that's a skill that we've lost. I started this podcast by talking about 43 years ago in 1980 being caught up in the environment, being in college, and I loved it. And I always envisioned this is what college is about. You sit next to other young people with these great ideas on philosophies of life, and you discuss and you debate. And even if we disagreed, well, why do you believe that? Well, I was raised this way. Well, I believe this. And like I said, nobody yelled and screamed, and I'll never be in the same room with that person. You guys are almost a throwback, or are you?
It took some learning. Yeah. It takes some learning. An inherent nature, and by the way, this is harder for those who love us and like us than it is really for he and I. It's an inherent nature that you want. I'm going to get to it. Okay. There's an inherent nature that you want to win every argument. And when we first started on the radio together, or we would do public forums together, if John said something that maybe licked me across the mouth, I'd want to get back in and lick him across. Well, where does it stop? Where does it stop? So what we finally realized is, hey, you make your point. You make your point. Sometimes you get to knock the other guy a little harder than the other guy knocks it. It aggravates the heck out of people. How come you didn't go back at John with this, that, or the other? And it's like,
oh, I'll get that when people watch these podcasts, yeah, I'm sure. But it is what it is.
Because for what purpose? John understood my argument. I understood his argument. We still have the humanity and love for each other. We can disagree with the way that we're going. It's not to say that things haven't gotten heated at times, but at the end of the day, what purpose does it serve to be red-faced and yelling at each other for a person who's a lot like me? I mean, the guy, we have more in common than we have different. Mm-hmm. And which, by the way, I feel that way about a guy in India right now or in South America, or, we as humans have more in common than we have difference. And part of it's just sometimes just opening up your ears and listening a little bit. You can still make your point. You can still think the guy's crazy and disagree with him, but it doesn't take away from his humanity, and that you can start to see that these people that is your enemy, may not be your enemy, maybe just the person you have a difference of agreement with, and it could wind up being your best friend. And that's what I found.
Yeah, it's amazing. And you were touching on this, that people on both sides, people who love you, people who love John Hancock, get more upset about your friendship than you guys.
Totally.
Because you're not supposed to talk to the other side
Right.
like that.
Yeah.
You can't be friends with that guy.
No, people will come up to us when we're at ball games together. We're sitting in my seats. Hancock won't ever buy. People will come up and give me trouble or give him trouble. We both have learned how to deal with it. It's hard to explain to people, like, I understand that you want me to go back and forth, but where does it stop? You kind of knew where I was. You kind of know where he is, and somewhere in the middle is where the truth is going to reside. And let's just move on and find those places that we can agree. And I don't want to sound too Pollyannish, like, we're a couple of guys who skip, down the road together holding hands. I mean, like I said, he's wrong on almost everything.
Well, he says the same thing about you.
There's a hint of the similarity between us of wanting to accomplish the same goal, potentially through different means.
You know what's interesting? That's how I am with my father and I, in that we disagree vehemently politically. And I don't say this just because he's my father. He is a wonderfully decent human being. He really is. And so he wonders where he went wrong raising me. And he says that
Right.
half jokingly
Sure.
only. And I can joke back at him. And there are times where we've had to say, we should drop this topic now, because we can feel the temperature starting to go up, and it's not worth it, like you said. So we'll leave that topic at that point and go in a different direction. But it doesn't just have to be within the family. You two guys have shown that, and I still believe most Americans are like that. But when you've got people wanting you to really go after the other guy, part of it is also when we can go on cable news and we can see the anger and the vitriol, and that gets us going. And then we go and watch Hancock and Kelley. Wait a minute, you're not like what I just saw on TV. You're not American doing that.
Right.
And that's part of the problem. I'm a First Amendment guy. We need that. I support it. I just think people need to be aware. I don't know if people are going to like this, that you're being played for suckers. You are. And they need you to get angry. They need you to get upset over this, because next time you see something online, that's clickbait, and you're going to get on that. And you mentioned it, the algorithms are going to keep you in this vicious circle, and you're being played for suckers. Pull out.
Yeah. It's dopamine, right?
Yeah.
It's essentially
It's been
dopamine
proven.
that's coming into us. And that's just one of the brilliant things about Donald Trump, is he was able to tap into that dopamine of anger, and that we all have it inside of us. It can be exploited. We all have love inside of us, and it can be exploited. So, you've got to go into the world with your eyes wide open, and, life experience changes you. I'm not sure that John and I would have the relationship we have today if we both grew up and were going to high school together.
Yeah.
The fact that we came from two separate walks of life, we were jammed into this really crazy environment together, where we had to get to know each other independently of preconceived notions. And, it's evolved in one of the great friendships of my life. If for some reason I were to die tragically, he will be giving the eulogy at my funeral, because I love him. There is nothing I wouldn't do for John Hancock except vote for Donald Trump or some Republican.
Well, I think that's a great place to end this. But I will end the same way I did with John, and that is, it's 2024. It's the day after the election. Who just won?
Joe Biden.
You believe that? Okay.
I do believe it. I just don't see a pathway. With what I know today, that Donald Trump is likely to be the Republican nominee, I don't see a pathway for it. I know too many traditional conservative Republicans who can't find themselves going through another 4 years of Donald Trump's lunacy. And from my perspective, not even conservative thought processes. So if the world is coming down between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, I believe Joe Biden will get elected, and I hope I'm not silent on election night like I was the first time Donald Trump won.
Well, then I'll ask a final question, 1B then. make it more difficult. It's not Donald Trump on the Republican side. And pick your DeSantis or Nikki Haley or Tim Scott or whoever. Anybody else, are you that confident with Joe Biden's answer there?
Yeah.
You are.
I just think it's so hard for Republicans to win the White House with the states that they have to win and through the upper Midwest, particularly as it relates to abortion and guns. The suburbs are where the fight is at these days. It's not the person who lives in the inner city, and it's not the person who lives in rural America. It's the person who's probably got a Home Depot less than a mile from their house and a Culver's right around the corner. Those are the folks that are going to decide who our next president is, and they're the ones who are living the real-life consequences of guns and abortion.
We will all be smarter a year and a half from now or so, something like that. Michael Kelley, thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
You're a good man, Dave.
Well, thank you, sir. You are too. And I know one person's not going to win is John Anderson. I can't vote for him this time. Didn't work last time either. So anyway, thank you, everybody. Take care. We'll talk to you next time. Thank you so much for listening, and please forward the link to this podcast to friends, family, neighbors, even strangers. They'll thank you later. If you'd like more information on our wealth management team, just go to your search engine and type in Simons and Cordes, SIMONS and CORDES, Simons and Cordes, and the website will be the first thing that pops up. I'll talk to you again soon on the next episode of the Simon Says podcast.